solidarity campaign for both myself and Ali for organising this event, and also here at the university. I'd like to thank Alex, Muriel, Raphael, and Lucy for taking care of the pair of us when we arrived in sunny Leeds, as it will be known henceforth this afternoon. Or the Paris of the North, as Ali prefers to call it. And I'd just briefly like to echo what Ali said about the importance of the work you're doing here. I know you've been getting grief from authorities here in the university and from Zionists who appear to have been bussed in from outside the university. I know that they're trying to bully and intimidate you, but I can see that there's a good number of people here, and I can see that you're not going to be bullied and intimidated, so fair play to you. My friends, it is a cliche to say that a trip to Jerusalem is like going back in time. And usually when you see that cliche being used in travel brochures, the copywriters are referring to a biblical era. But at one stage when I was in Jerusalem just last month, I didn't feel like the clocks had been wound back a few millennia. Instead, I felt like they had been wound back a few decades. Spending a Friday afternoon in Silwan, in East Jerusalem, which is right beside the old city in East Jerusalem, reminded me of the north of Ireland in the early 1970s. Now, admittedly, I was still a baby in nappies on the 30th of January 1972, when the British Army opened fire on a civil rights demonstration in the city of Derry, killing 14 unarmed men. But I've seen grainy photographs taken on that day on so many occasions that I've developed something of an obsession about that massacre, which of course is now known as Bloody Sunday, and its pivotal place in recent Anglo-Irish history. Now, fortunately, I didn't see anybody get killed in East Jerusalem, but what I did see was extremely aggressive behaviour by Israeli security forces towards Palestinians, and that behaviour appeared eerily similar to how British troops had treated the Catholic community in the north of Ireland when I was growing up. Just after I arrived in the Silwan area, a Palestinian youth hurled a rock at the 30 or so Israeli police officers and soldiers who had gathered there in full riot gear, and whose presence in the area was clearly invasive and provocative. The Israeli forces responded to this lone rock by firing tear gas at the Palestinian youths. This tear gas, incidentally, is manufactured in New Jersey in the United States. And the use of this tear gas, we know, frequently causes asphyxiation. Furthermore, locals in Silwan have gathered evidence that the Israeli forces have been firing tear gas from canisters that have passed their sell-by date, their expiry date, I should say. And this is despite warnings from doctors that the older the substance is, the more toxic it becomes. The first thing I noticed when I arrived in Silwan was that there had been a proliferation of Israeli flags in the area since my previous visit there in 2009. This is a sure sign that Palestinians are being driven from their homes by force, and that their homes are being handed over to Israeli settlers in clear contravention of international law. European Union diplomats, including British diplomats based in East Jerusalem, appear to be troubled by the intensification of settlement activity in East Jerusalem. A secret report drawn up by many of these diplomats, which was leaked to the press earlier this year, noted that there are now about 190,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem. That's a huge number when you consider that the total number of Israeli settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories comes to about 500,000. As these European Union diplomats live and work in occupied Palestine, they are fully aware of how ordinary Palestinians are being uprooted and dispossessed by the state of Israel. But of course, the European Union doesn't only have diplomats stationed in East Jerusalem. There are also many European Union diplomats in Tel Aviv, in Washington, and in Brussels, who are more inclined to side with the oppressor than with the oppressed for narrow geostrategic reasons. This helps explain why the European Union's approach to East Jerusalem has been quite muddled. The report I mentioned a moment ago by those diplomats expresses particular concern about a project called the City of David. This is an archaeological project, and as part of this project, Palestinian homes in Silwan are being seized to make way for a park, an archaeological park, in honour of King David, who's reputed to have spent time in the area 3,000 years ago. In the report, the diplomats criticised the way that a pro-settler group called Elad has been tasked with managing many of the archaeological sites that Israel regards as central to this project. The report I just mentioned notes that Elad has entered into a partnership with the state-owned Israel Antiquities Authority, and that this authority is paid directly by Elad to carry out excavations without Palestinian involvement or international oversight. Despite that clear message, there is a very serious omission in the report. It fails to acknowledge that the Israel Antiquities Authority is among the participants in a European Union funded scheme called Euromed Heritage. This scheme has been allocated about 13.5 million euros or 12 million pounds between 2008 and 2012. The involvement of the Israel Antiquities Authority in this scheme comes despite the fact that its headquarters are located in the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem. And this is just one example of how the European Union is failing to live up to its legal obligations not to deal with Israeli institutions that are based in East Jerusalem, and not to do anything that would confer recognition on Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem in 1967. Another example of this complicity is that Europol, which is the European Union's police headquarters, police cooperation office, is also examining ways of boosting its dealings with the Israeli National Police, despite how the Israeli National Police have their headquarters in another part of East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. So what we have then is a deplorable situation of double standards. One part of the European Union's bureaucracy appears determined to avoid doing anything that would legitimise Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem. Yet another part of the same bureaucracy is recognising that annexation in an underhand manner. So in other words, the European Union is chastising Israel with one side of its mouth and kissing Israel with the other. Now, almost every time I've given a talk about the European Union's relationship with Israel, and I should just stress, I know sometimes the newspapers in this country give the impression that Britain isn't really part of the European Union, or has a very uneasy relationship with the European Union. And there might be a certain grain of truth in this when it comes to certain economic matters and so on. But when it comes to foreign policy, Britain is actively involved in every aspect of the European of shaping the European Union's foreign policies to the extent that the woman in charge of managing the European Union's foreign policies at the moment, Catherine Ashton, is Britain's representative in Brussels. So, as I said, every time that I've been given a talk, that I've given a talk on Israel's relationship with the European Union, somebody's asked me, "What's in it for Europe?" That's a good question, because the benefits for Europe from this relationship are not immediately obvious. But from talking to European Union officials in Brussels, I've realised that some of them are in awe of Israel. They are particularly in awe of how Israel has turned itself into the kind of high-tech economy that they would like the European Union to become. Israel allocates about 5% of its gross domestic product to scientific research, which is a huge amount. On a proportionate basis, it's about twice as much as the Americans do. By contrast, the European Union's 27 countries collectively allocate about 2% of their gross domestic product to scientific research, which is well below a target of 3% that they set for the year that has just passed, the year 2010. And even though the European Union governments missed that target, scientific research is a high priority for the EU's executive, the European Commission, and it's one of the main areas of expenditure for the budget that the European Commission administers. The European Commission's Science Department is particularly envious of how technology accounts for about 40% of Israel's total exports, and how such advances as instant text messaging on the internet were pioneered by Israeli companies. So for that reason, there's a feeling among some Brussels officials that the European Union must foster close relations with Israel if Europe's own technology sector is ever to flourish. But Israel's innovations are not confined to innocuous inventions that we use every time we log onto the internet or every time we use a mobile phone. Israel is also a top manufacturer of some of the most lethal weapons, at least the most lethal conventional weapons that we have in the world today. And I should also highlight that Israel is also a nuclear power. It was Israel, not Iran, incidentally, that introduced nuclear weapons to the Middle East. Indeed, if you look at data that was compiled recently by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is one of the best sources available of data on the arms industry in the world, 3 Israeli companies feature in the latest list that institute has compiled of the world's top 100 arms companies. The names of those 3 companies are Elbit, Israel Aerospace Industries, and Rafael. And all 3 of these companies are agents of Israeli apartheid. According to the definition of apartheid that was approved by the United Nations back in 1973, when I was just two years old, apartheid involves the domination of one racial group over another. 2 of the companies I mentioned, Elbit and Israel Aerospace Industries, make the pilotless drones or unmanned aerial vehicles that were used to bomb civilians in Gaza in 2008 and 2009. I haven't looked into this, but it's entirely conceivable also that these companies made the warplanes that were used in the recent attacks, not the recent, the attacks yesterday, wasn't it, in Gaza and today that have had such dreadful consequences. And all 3 of these companies make the surveillance equipment that has been used to lock Palestinians into what the anthropologist and political activist Jeff Halper calls a matrix of control. So clearly then, their products are being used to subjugate Palestinians in a way that fulfills the the United Nations definition of apartheid. There's another thing that these 3 companies have in common. All three of them are benefiting from scientific research grants administered by the European Union. So in other words, all three of them are being subsidised directly by the European Union taxpayer. Israel is the main foreign participant in the European Union's multi-annual programme for scientific research. This programme, which is known as, officially as the Framework Programme for Scientific Research, has been allocated about 53 billion euros between 2007 and 2013, that works out at about 46.3 billion pounds. At the moment, Israel is taking part in 800 EU-financed research projects, which have a total value of 4.3 billion euros. And the Israelis are expecting that they will have directly drawn down more than 500 million euros worth of science grants by the time that this programme wraps up in the year 2013. The awarding of public grants to these merchants of debt and destruction makes a mockery of European Union assurances that all of the research in question is of a civilian nature. There are no safeguards in place to prevent these companies from applying the fruits of European Union funded research for military ends. And I know for a fact that the discussions are taking place at the moment between European Union officials and the arms industry about the possibility of funding hardcore military research during the next phase of this programme, which will start in 2014. Indeed, academics in Manchester, which isn't exactly a million miles away from here, are coordinating some of these discussions. And without doubt, the Israeli government and its friends in the arms industry will be keeping a very close eye on how these discussions progress. As I mentioned earlier, apartheid has been treated as a crime by the United Nations since 1973. More recently, it's been treated as a crime against humanity under the 2002 Rome Statute, under which the International Criminal Court was set up. The European Union, including Britain, is nominally a strong supporter of the International Criminal Court, even though perhaps a certain Prime Minister of this country should be appearing before that government. It hasn't been. Britain, nonetheless, has been supportive of it. So there's clearly an obligation on Britain and the European Union to take robust action against apartheid, no matter where the crime of apartheid occurs. Just last month, the European Union senior representative rolled out the red carpet for Avigdor Lieberman, the Israeli foreign minister, when he visited Brussels. And since joining the Israeli government in 2009, Lieberman and his party Yisrael Beitenu, or Israel Our Home, have made overtly racist statements, an increasingly common feature of debates in the Israeli parliament, or the Knesset. In October of last year, for example, a Yisrael Beitenu parliamentarian called David Rotem said, and I quote, "Every Jewish community needs one Arab. Otherwise, who will repair my fridge when it breaks down on the Sabbath?" End quote. Now just imagine for a second that a member of Parliament here in Britain was to say something similar about black people. How many seconds would it take before that member of Parliament was reprimanded? But in the Knesset, people like Rotem and his colleagues in Lieberman's party can spout that kind of hateful invective without fear of being reprimanded, without fear of being disciplined. And worse again, Yisrael Beitenu has sponsored about 20 laws and bills in the Knesset in the past couple of years, all of which are designed to make Israel's system of apartheid even more draconian than it already is. The party is seeking to make Arab citizens of Israel swear an oath of allegiance to a Jewish and democratic state, in inverted commas, which of course is a contradiction in terms, given that genuine democracies cherish people of all religions and none equally. Yisrael Beitenu has also tried to prohibit commemorations of the Nakba, which, as Ali mentioned, was a wave of ethnic cleansing that led to Israel's formation in the 1940s. They're also seeking to limit the rights of Palestinians to meet with lawyers, Palestinian prisoners to meet with lawyers. And just in the past few weeks, the Knesset has considered introducing a ban on many activities promoting a boycott of Israeli goods and institutions. Now, after meeting Lieberman last month, the European Union issued a lengthy statement on its relationship with Israel. The statement came to 45 paragraphs, yet just one of those paragraphs, was devoted to the raft of apartheid-enhancing legislation that is wending its way through the Knesset at the moment. That paragraph zoned in on just one aspect of that legislation, one draft law, and that's a law which will affect the funding affect human rights organisations in Israel that receive foreign funding. And of course that's an important issue, and it's correct that the European Union should voice concern about it, but it's inexcusable that the European Union is generally remaining silent about the worsening nature of Israeli apartheid. Indeed, it's instructive that the European Union, and again this includes Britain, is refusing to even use the word apartheid in relation to Israel. Absurdly, the European Union considers anybody who calls out Israel as a racist endeavour to be an anti-Semite. I'm not joking about this. The definition of anti-Semitism that's followed by the Fundamental Rights Agent, which is an official European Union body based in Vienna, says that describing Israel as racist amounts to anti-Semitism. And it's no coincidence that this definition was drawn up in consultation with several Zionist lobby groups who want to muzzle any criticism of the state of Israel by deliberately, and in most cases inaccurately, equating it with anti-Semitism. The same statement, the European Union statement I mentioned a moment ago, called on Israel to act towards improving the rights of Palestinians living within Israel. And according to a minority rights group called Adalah, this was the first time that the European Union has used a formal meeting with an Israeli foreign minister to register concern about the Palestinian community that numbers about 1.4 million, the Palestinian community within Israel that numbers about 1.4 million people, or about 1/5 of Israel's population. So in some respects, the statement is commendable. Yet it should be noted that the statement is otherwise quite weak. There's no explicit recognition, for example, of how the Jewish National Fund directly owns 13% of the land of Israel and has a role in managing most of the remainder. There is no direct condemnation of how the Jewish National Fund is actively taking steps to clear that land, to clear the land of what it sees as the land of Israel of Palestinians by, among other things, destroying Bedouin villages in the Negev. And even though the Jewish National Fund is effectively a criminal organisation and is a linchpin of Israeli apartheid, it is treated as a charity with all the attendant benefits, including a tax exempt status, by a number of European Union countries, including Britain, because the Jewish National Fund is involved in planting trees in areas in areas from which Palestinians have been uprooted, in areas in which Palestinian villages have been erased. It's able to masquerade as an environmental organisation, as a kind of a Zionist Greenpeace. David Cameron himself is among its patrons. Moreover, it's significant that the European Union has never made the strengthening of its relations with Israel conditional on respect for the Palestinian minority within Israel. That's despite how the contractual basis of the relations between the European Union and Israel, which is in the form of a so-called association agreement that came into effect in 2000, states that these contractual relations are supposed to be based on respect for fundamental human rights by both sides. Now, although the European Union may not have the same amount of influence in the world as the United States, the European Union is far from powerless. The European Union is Israel's main destination for exports. A total trade between the two sides was worth about 20 billion euros, or 17.3 billion pounds in 2009, the latest year for which we have full figures. So, because Israel is a trade-dependent economy, one of the best ways to pressurise it is by reducing the volume of that trade. But alas, I think it'd be fanciful to expect our governments to actually take steps to reduce the volume of that trade. Indeed, David Cameron, towards the end of last year, gave an address to the Conservative Friends of Israel, and quite an influential grouping within the Conservative Party, and he said that the best thing to do is to increase trade with Israel. That was his response to the calls for the boycott, the BDS for boycott, divestments and sanctions. He argued that the opposite should be done, that the trade with Israel should be increased. Again, what's absolutely appalling is that rather than actually reducing the volume of trade, the European Union has actually extended the scope of trade preferences that it offers to Israel. Following Operation Cast Lead, the attacks in Gaza in 2008 and 2009, the EU decided to extend the scope, particularly of trade preferences offered to agricultural goods coming into food products coming into Europe. I don't know about here in Leeds, but when I go to my local supermarket where I live in Brussels, the shelves are teeming with produce that is labelled made in Israel, and most of that produce has come into Europe without having to pay customs duties. My friends, it was in a humble grocery shop that I first learned about apartheid in South Africa. One day when I was still a young fella, I heard my mother telling the shop owner that she wouldn't be buying the oranges that were on sale that day because they came from a land where black people were denied elementary rights. And years later, I visited the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, where there was a whole section devoted to how a boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, BDS campaign, helped end white minority rule in South Africa. Now, just as my mother's simple action helped educate me about the iniquities of racism in South Africa, BDS can help raise awareness about Israeli apartheid. BDS is a tangible and practical way for all of us to express our solidarity with the Palestinians who have to live with the consequences of Israeli apartheid every single day of their lives. I was very delighted to see that you have a campaign here to bin Veolia. As I said, I was in Jerusalem last month. I saw that there's a lot of work going on, that there's basically been trial runs being undertaken of the light rail system in Jerusalem, which Veolia has been intimately involved with. The system which will be linking up Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, and it is an important project for the expansion and the deepening of Israeli apartheid. Appears ready to go any second. Veolia has been intimately involved in that, so any action that targets Veolia is action that should be supported. Now, a recent opinion poll by the BBC indicated that Israel is one of the least popular countries in the world in terms of public opinion. Without demonising ordinary Israelis in any way, I encourage you to do what you can to make the state of Israel even more reviled. Israel, my friends, needs to be told in plain and simple terms that it has no right to exist as an apartheid state. Everything must be done to defeat apartheid. Thanks very much.